Good day, everyone. Over the past few weeks, we have learned many principles and methods that we can apply for when we decide to become teachers in the future or instructors in the future. And now we are down to a last topic for this group, which is teaching grammar and standards. I am pretty confident that we are already aware or we're already familiar with the concepts we are about to share here in grammar teaching. Now, without further ado, let's dive right into it. Standard English reigned supreme as the dialect used for instruction and evaluation, especially here in the Philippines. Back then, when we were still in primary school, if my memory serves me right, we had this bilingual policy wherein we can only speak the two official languages, the Filipino and the English. And when it's English time, we are strictly instructed to only speak in that language. Yeah, and we can see in a lot of establishments, street names, road signs that English is very much prevalent here in the Philippines. Now that it is, of course, it's one of our official languages. Interestingly, this dominant dialect boasts minimal variation from place to place, particularly in its grammatical structure. So the grammatical structure is not as different as we think it is. Now, due to its widespread use, Standard English often goes unnoticed until someone encounters something they deem incorrect. Do you remember placing the language? Yes. That is why we Filipinos are often dubbed as grammar Nazis because we tend to correct each other's grammar. Or in some cases, others tend to make fun of someone else's grammar. Now, this has led grammar instruction to prioritize relatively minor debatable grammar points and neglecting the vast areas where English users worldwide find common ground, such as actual day-to-day communication. We have deviated from those kind of instruction. We now became more technical or more specific in grammar. This approach acknowledges the reality of English, that it is a language flourishing in global context and used by both native and non-native speakers in every corner of the world. Can you give me an example of a country which has English as one of their official languages? Yep, there's a lot. There's Singapore, India, a lot more actually. That's why we have this thing called Singlish, and Philippine English, of course. The challenges of teaching Standard English within this global framework then come into focus. Defining correctness, or if you can recall our topic in language and politics, we determine what is acceptable in a language, incorporating real-world English usage into learning, and fostering students' confidence while offering necessary corrections. We are now more focused in answering how can it be determined as Standard English, and how can teachers teach students what they see and hear in real life, and how can teachers help students foster confidence in using Standard English. Now, speaking of Standard English, let us define Standard English first. Of course, we already have an idea what it is, but I will call my dear friend Ricky to help us define Standard English more.
It is hard to determine the definition of Standard English simply by quoting from another person. It is mostly defined as the variety used in written texts, with correctness determined by consensus among influential writers. But even that definition is vague, for Standard English is a living dialect constantly evolving, making precise definition challenging. So, Standard English is described as the form used in written materials, where correctness is decided by agreement among influential writers. Defining it precisely is difficult because Standard English is a living dialect that constantly changes over time. Grammar rules are inferred from texts, but reliable reference sources can be challenging to find. Most writers rely, such as editors, to check if their grammar is correct. The editors make changes based on grammar rules that different English users may disagree on. Also, they correct mistakes to ensure the text is aligned with the accepted standards of Standard English. Global dialect, Standard English isn't a remote, perfect form of English. It's the most common and globally used dialect taught formally to both native and non-native speakers. Differences in sentence structure and verb usage exist between text types, but do not affect whether a text is considered Standard English. Determining if a text is in Standard English isn't how often passive verbs are used, but rather if the choices made in the texts are consistent with the rules and conventions of Standard English.
So here is an example of a children's short story by Eric Carle, The Very Hungry Caterpillar, and an academic journal by Crick and Watson, 1954. The differences here is that the children's short story has shorter sentences than the academic journal, while the academic journal or article has a greater variety of types of verbs that you would see here in the text that were used many times. Standard English grammar shows almost no variation across regions. What's considered Standard English in Nigeria is almost entirely the same as in Canada. Abbreviated text types. Abbreviated text types like headlines or SMS messages use a different grammar than ordinary Standard English, leaving out words like articles, like the or a, and subjects like I or he. Most users understand this is normal for these types of messages. The key feature here is that despite disagreements, there are core grammar rules that everyone agrees on for Standard English.
So for this part, let me ask you a question. Is there a regional variation in Standard English grammar? How can you say so? So back then in 1960s, I recall, social linguists began to study English as a world language. However, Standard English back then was pretty much based on the UK and US English. So you pretty much have an idea of what happened. English from former colonies like Singapore, India, Nigeria, Philippines was viewed as having interference error. It did not pretty much fully adhere to their standard. However, it's now widely accepted that these varieties have their own legitimacy. Social linguists initially aimed to elevate the status of English from former colonies, advocating for local acceptance of their linguistic features as standards. This takes me back to our history of the English language, the hegemony of the English language. You can remember that. With the internet providing access to diverse texts worldwide, it's become evident that many perceived differences are merely variations in frequency, not categorical distinctions. There's a difference between, one thing I've noticed is that the difference between Filipino English and Singaporean English. Singaporean English are slightly more similar to British English, and then Filipino English, we adhere more to American English. Just sharing, grammar differences between Standard English varieties are minimal, with a statistical variation in preferences.
So now we move on to the criterial features for Standard English. Mastering Standard English hinges on a strong understanding of four key grammar areas. The first one is inflectional morphology. Inflectional morphology involves changes in nouns, pronouns, and verbs depending on their grammatical rules. Example, the S and ES. such as words like books and dishes. The second one is verb structure. Verb structure allows for up to 4 auxiliary verbs for the main verb, with a specific order and form for each. The third one is interrogatives with do. It requires rearranging the verb and subject and often adding a specific form of do. Example, are you? To do you? And the last criterial feature for standard English is negation. Standard English negation with the word not can be complex, sometimes requiring insertion of do and changing some to any. Unlike other languages, Standard English avoids making things sound negative by using multiple negative words together. Example, I swim negates to I do not swim. I want some negates to I do not want any.
Exposure to non-standard grammar is inevitable, even for learners where English isn't spoken. Understanding standard English structures allows students to learn effectively from various sources. Below are examples of both standard English and non-standard English usage. Aiming for standard English involves following specific grammar rules, and not doing so can lead to mistakes. Spoken language differs from written language, with speakers having more freedom. Some structures common in speech are rare in writing, like discourse markers, such as the word thank you, yes, and okay. Example of Ranks using Jamaican patois in his song highlights deliberate choices outside of standard English. As you can see that the lyrics are not written in standard English, but rather they sound more likely influenced or yeah, it is used with a Jamaican patois. But this wouldn't be appropriate to use in formal writing, but it can be used or effective in music writing or song lyrics.